Welcome back, everyone. At the end of the last video, I was explaining how by the mid-1950s, the Chinese Communist government had moved forward to the process of collectivization. Basically, the government was taking control and directing all the processes of agriculture in the nation of China, and that the peasants who initially had been quite excited to receive land from the government now realize that they are more enslaved to the government than they had been previously. Even though they're told that this land is land that's owned by the people, it's land that's controlled by the government. In 1958, Mao debuted his policy that was known as "Let 100,000 flowers bloom," and it was a policy that was stated to encourage ideas, including complaints about how this new Republic of China should be governed. But when the party was criticized, they changed this policy and denounced those who had complained as rightists. So this policy ends up becoming a way to kind of discover who the opponents of the communist regime are in China. Those who complained against the party were ostracized, were imprisoned, and their families were ostracized. Mao assumed that 10% of the population were quote-unquote rightists who were opposed to communism in China. And so he, based on this assumption, he demanded or he instructed those of his followers to attack the most conservative 10% of society. So you can see how this is sort of the paranoia of an authoritarian state. The sort of random determination that 10% of the population are opposed to you or are enemies of the state, which justifies taking stringent measures against them. Those who were seized on the accusation of being rightist would not be released unless they confessed to being rightist, which meant that the paranoia is self-perpetuating. They confess they're rightist. Bingo, this shows there are people out there who are opposed to the Communist Party. We need a more stringent approach. So about 1 million people are convicted. The intellectuals in Chinese society were silenced, imprisoned, sent to labor camps, or to work on the land. The Chinese had doubled industry output in 5 years. Remember, this is kind of the broader overarching goal of communist China at this point, is to turn China into an industrial power. Mao was still, however, in competition with the Soviet Union, and wanted to show that China was going to be more successful at implementing communism. And so he began the Great Leap Forward program. It was a program designed to industrialize China at a rapid rate so that China could match the industrialized output of the Western world in 15 years. And so it's a plan to mobilize China and the workers of China to work night and day, promising them a future of wealth if they would contribute to this program, if they would buy into this program and participate in this program. Communes were formed of thousands of families across villages. Parents were expected to work around the clock, while children were left in mass nurseries and family life disappeared. And so the thing is that the Chinese people were true believers in this communist program, and that the Chinese people fully bought into the program. They embraced it. They were willing, as they saw it, to leave and abandon their children in the care of the state. They saw the state as having their children's best interests at heart. They were willing to abandon their children and work basically around the clock with just sleeping shifts, no society, no leisure, on the understanding that they are working in the threat of an existential overthrow of the Chinese state, on the understanding that if they did this, they would end up creating an era of peace and prosperity. And so people collected all the things made out of iron and steel to melt them down. They had to find fuel to keep furnaces burning day and night, even burning down the coffins of the dead in order to fuel these furnaces. And so these people are working insanely hard, but the steel that they made was not good. So they were told steel production is what's necessary for China. The government needs steel production, but the furnaces were not advanced enough, and so the steel that they made was cracked. And so you read about the recollections of Chinese people at the time who remember that they've now given up all their iron and steel, all their tools that have been melted down, but what's been produced instead is cracked metal that's basically useless. And so you already start to see the failures of this attempt to fully industrialize a country as large as China in 15 years. At the same time, the government wanted to increase agricultural output from a smaller number of farmers in order to free up more people to work on the industrial program. And so they tried planting the crops closer together than previously and using more fertilizer. And the local peasant organizations wanted to please the government, and so they over-reported their production. They said, oh yes, we're meeting these increased production standards. And so the state would come and they would say, well, we asked you to produce 100 bags, did you do it? Peasant organizations, the local peasant organizations say, oh yes, we're only showing you part of it now. Of course, that's all they've produced, but it's all going to be there. And so the government would say, okay, then we can take 85 bags of the rice that you've been growing because you only need 15 for yourselves. The government thanks you. Your hard work is enabling the growth of industry, this useless steel that's being produced. And then more peasants would starve. And we're told that the peasants in China became so hungry and so desperate they didn't even have the strength to bury the bodies of those who died. They would only look at them in the streets and see the rats eating them. Peasants in these deprived areas, as the state started to realize the extent of the crisis, were not allowed to leave their local areas. Why? Because then other people would realize that there was a hunger crisis in China at the time. Instead, they had to remain in their own areas. We're told that they became so desperate that they ate earth, which destroyed their intestines. And 30 million people died. At least 30 million people died. And so this is one of the greatest famines in human history that results from Mao's efforts to achieve this communist utopia. Practices start to change in the 1960s as a result of this famine. The leadership of the Chinese Communist government recognizes we have to make changes, otherwise we're not going to have enough food, everyone is going to die. And so they start to make the switch from trying to create heavy industry to trying to build consumer goods. Easier to carry out the manufacturing. This is kind of the way the world economy is headed anyway, and the peasants are allowed to make money on the side. So they're not forced to work 14, 15-hour days as they had been previously. Mao, however, sees these liberalizations as oppositions to the spread of communism. He sees this as a failure to carry out the revolution. He blames the failures to achieve an industrial revolution in China, to achieve an agricultural revolution in China, as the result of the anti-revolutionaries that he's convinced himself are working within the Chinese population to prevent the implementation of communism. And so he institutes what's known as the Cultural Revolution, an effort to purge China of the influence of those who are opposed to communism. And so his associates begin distributing little red books of Mao's sayings in order to encourage total and cultish devotion to Mao. Mao calls on young people to rise up, overthrow the Communist Party itself, which he now sees as not radical enough, and to achieve the true revolution of communism. So bands of young people who call themselves the Red Guards, at Mao's urging, begin to rise up against the authority figures in the society. And they were told that this was their opportunity, this was their great chance to break away from their parents and to do whatever they wanted. This is actually very typical of dictators. People often miss this, but it's actually pretty typical of dictators to use young people, the youth, those who are teenagers and in their early 20s, these people typically are more idealistic, they typically have less to lose, they're also typically more gullible. And so while oftentimes we see people saying that greater engagement of young people is necessary or is a good thing for society, oftentimes young people can be who have less experience, who have less to lose in this society, can be used and manipulated by authoritarian governments more effectively. And that's what's happening here. These young people in China who have no farms, no families to lose, are much more easily radicalized by Mao to carry out this very radical purge of Chinese society. So they're told to destroy the four olds and any Western influence they can find in this society. Four olds are customs, old cultures, old cultural practices, old habits, and old ideas. And so this is where you start to see efforts by Mao to fully reject the history and traditions of Chinese culture. So you start to see practices of changing street names, of attacking museums, of destroying temples, of suggesting that anything that is a part of China's history is a symbol of oppression that needs to be destroyed. Writers and academics were humiliated, their belongings were taken from them. Bands of these Red Guards roamed the countryside and were told to struggle against intellectuals, landlords, state officials, elders in their community, their own family members. Now, it's called struggling against because these people, by their own existence, are said to be oppressing the Red Guards, to be oppressing the young people in the society, and to be oppressing Mao. So they call it struggling against, but really it means beating and humiliating those who are seen as living or holding offices that themselves are acts of oppression. Somewhere between 400,000 and 20 million people are killed. And you have these pretty horrific accounts of teenagers taking off their belts and beating old men and women because the old is something that's seen as oppressive to these people. At first, the Red Guards only came from families with impeccable communist pedigrees, but then other students started to form rival guard groups. The army supplied the different factions and fought with the different factions. And eventually the students are out of control. And eventually Mao has to use the army in order to terrorize the students and suppress the students into obedience, and in order to disband these student groups that have become frightening even to Mao himself. And so by 1968, the country was under a full military repression, in which making jokes could land you 10 years in jail, in which there was a loyalty dance to Mao that everyone was expected to do twice a day. Mao died in 1976. 3 years later, his Cultural Revolution was declared a failure. What's interesting is that China will remain a one-party state. So socially and politically, it will remain a communist dictatorship, essentially, or a communist authoritarian government. Economically, however, it will abandon communist policies of collectivism and instead promote a sort of capitalism that's organized and driven and controlled by the government. And we'll talk a little more about the legacy of Mao and the history of China in the second half of the 20th century in the next video.